Hi, everyone. Welcome to my Eyes on Eurasia podcast with Glenn Howard. Well, we got a great lineup today. In today's episode, we're going to be examining the situation in Mali, where in the past week, Al Qaeda linked militants launched a coordinated offensive that struck at the heart of the Malian state. And it ended up killing the defense minister, Sadio Kamara. And Moscow's key ally in Bamako, which is the capital of Mali, was eliminated in a suicide bombing attack, and that ended up forcing Russian-backed forces have been operating in Mali into retreat across multiple strategic points in the country, including in the symbolic northern stronghold of Kidal, where the Russians have been operating. For those who have not been following all these events the last few years, there's been a military junta in power in Mali since around 2020, and they made a decisive break with the West and expelling French forces and betting instead on the Russians to restore order. And in its place, replacing the United States, were the Russians, who Moscow stepped in with mercenaries as the former Wagner forces, they were called, were rebranded as the Africa Corps after the failed Prigozhin coup in Moscow in 2023. So since then, Russian mercenaries have been working in Mali under a rebranded name, providing security for the Malian military junta. But this week, that strategy unraveled in dramatic fashion, creating a setback for the Malian junta and Russian-backed forces. Basically, Mali's back in the news, and the government there is teetering on the edge again in a potential state collapse, and the implications extend far beyond the capital of Bamako. So, threatening it, in fact, to destabilize the entire Sahel region and reshape the geopolitical contest for influence across Africa. So, some experts are even saying that it could end up being another Afghanistan, so in terms of being a failed state. So what went wrong with Russia's intervention? What does this mean for the future of Mali's junta? And could this crisis draw the United States back into the region in some form, as it's largely stepped away from it? So joining us today to help us make sense of Mali and what's going on there are Africa experts Andrew McGregor and Jacob Zenn. Andrew McGregor is director of Eberfoyle International Security, a Toronto-based consultancy, and he specializes in security issues of Africa and the Islamic world. He's a graduate of the University of Toronto, the Near Eastern Studies Department, and he's the history of Darfur, and military history of Egypt, which was published in 2006. Jacob Zenn, our other speaker, is a well-known traveler and noted expert on militant movements in Africa, and he's the editor of the Terrorism Monitor publication published by the Jamestown Foundation. He's also a senior fellow there on African and Eurasian affairs, and he's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Security Studies program, and he's the author of Unmasking Boko Haram, Exploring Global Jihad in Nigeria, which is published by Lynn Reiner Publishers in 2020. So he's widely published on the area, and I'm really delighted that we've got these two great experts to kind of help us understand what's been happening in Mali. Andrew, I'm going to turn the floor over to you and kind of walk us through basically what's been happening in Mali, what led to the sudden flurry of events, and explain some of the actors involved in Mali and kind of share your insights on this. And then we'll kind of go to Jacob after that to kind of talk about, share his thoughts on it. So Andrew, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be with you today. So I'll just start with a bit of a very brief introduction to Mali. Not a country everyone knows much about. It's a landlocked country in West Africa. It's nearly 500,000 square miles and about 23 million people. 90% of the population is Muslim. You might think that that would disqualify there being some kind of religious aspect to the current war going on in Mali. But the introduction of Salafism in the 1990s to northern Mali has in fact created religious splits amongst parts of the northern population and much of the southern population. It's a very poor nation. Its main export is gold. Gold, in fact, represents 80% of their exports and 50% of their tax revenue. But despite this, most of the country is still agriculture-based and is often in dire poverty. Culturally and economically, you might say that Mali reached its peak in the 14th century and has been sliding downhill ever since. if you want to know the real problem with Mali, a good way to start is just to have a look at the outline of the country on a map. It has this strange bow tie shape with the largest section in the northeast part of the bowl. That's a very sparsely populated area, and it's a homeland of people such as the Tuareg. There's a number of Arabs living there, Sonrai, Fulani peoples. These are all mainly pastoral people concentrating on the herding of cattle and goats. And then in the smaller southwestern part of this bow tie is the area totally environmentally different, culturally different, linguistically different. And it has the majority of the population lives in that area. And while they are Muslim, Salafism is a very new thing in that area. And it's home to the largest ethnic group in Mali, which is the Bambara people, who are politically dominant and tend to run things from the capital, Bamako, in the south. So after a long period of various empires in Mali that were mostly very successful and some of them quite famous historically, you get up to the 19th century, when the area had begun to weaken politically and militarily, and this provided an opening for French colonists who began to penetrate the area. And by 1905, they had taken over all of Mali, which now went under the name French Sudan. During the wars, Mali became a major source of military manpower for the French, with many of these hundreds of thousands of troops going to Europe to fight under the French flag. The area got its independence in 1960 when most of the French Empire was breaking up. And since then, there's been a cycle of one-party states, military coups, brief stabs at democracy, and perhaps worst of all, military purges, which continue to weaken the armed forces and prevent them from restoring order during many different crises and revolts and rebellions that have emerged in Mali since independence. Just for example, in 2025, the American-trained Green Berets in Malian army decided to wipe out the mostly French-trained Red Berets, the paratroopers, and destroyed really a major elite unit that could have been used. And instead of being used, this devastation, this internal fighting in the army opened up the gate for a major Islamist uprising in northern Mali. And that began in 2012 and continued through 2013. The weakened Malian military was unable to cope with this at all, which led to all of northern Mali being taken over by Islamist forces. This lasted for nearly a year until there was French intervention in January 2013 with Operation Serval. The French, with cooperation of some of the regional countries that contributed armed forces, most notably Chad, were able to drive the Islamists out of northern Mali. And then Operation Serval was replaced with a new operation, Operation Barkhane, which this time was designed to be a more regional player through integrating the armed forces of some of the major Sahelian nations, such as Mali itself and its neighbors Niger and Burkina Faso. So Operation Barkhane continued until 2022. At that point, we had a military coup led by Colonel Assimi Goïta, who's now generally promoted himself after he took over. One of the major ideas behind the coup was to end all Western influence in Mali, and that meant ordering the expulsion of some 5,000 French troops and about 15,000 UN peacekeepers that had been brought in for the largest peacekeeping operation in the UN, and also its most dangerous, because most of the fighting never really ended just tended to be more sporadic and more isolated for about 10 years. So one of the main sources of revolt and rebellion in Mali has always been the Tuareg. They are a Berber group. They've been in the Saharan region since about 600 AD. They constitute only, say, 1.5% to 3% of Mali's population. But because of their militancy and their reputation as fighters and their dominant role in controlling the trans-Saharan trade routes for hundreds of years, they become very powerful in their own way. And with alleged support from France, as Malians will often claim, they have now had 4 rebellions against the Malian government. The most recent being having just started last year. So now, to replace the French and the peacekeepers, Mali had to look abroad. They weakened their army again with a new purge, this time of the so-called Brown Berets, the National Guard in Mali, who were thought to be supporting some of the main military leaders who were backing the entry of Russian forces into Mali. And that's what happened in 2021. The Russians entered in the form of the Wagner group. And this gave them some kind of distance from between Moscow and the operations of these Russians, commonly termed mercenaries, but actually controlled pretty tightly by Russian military intelligence, the GRU. They became well known through a number of operations of varying success, especially in northern Mali, developed a real reputation for atrocities, brutality, illegal detentions, much of this done in cooperation with the Malian regular army. But the biggest problem with the Russian forces has been their independent approach to when and where they should intervene militarily. This has been a big problem for the Malian general staff and the army command, because they tend not to respond when asked to respond and go out on operations whenever they feel like it and help themselves to whatever weapons they find in the armory and don't ask anyone's permission basically for anything. So there is a lot of tension between the regular army and the Russians, who in 2025 changed their structure and became known as the Africa Corps, this time as a much more integrated part of the Russian Defense Ministry. And they came under direct command of the Russian Defense Ministry, even though about 80% of their fighters were ex-Wagner group who merely signed on to the new unit. Now, facing these pro-government groups, well, and I should mention with the Tuareg that they are not all rebels. The Tuareg have never been politically united. It was what weakened them and allowed the French to first take them over after hundreds of years of independence. And they continue to have political differences. Much of the leadership of the rebel movement comes from the top class in Tuareg society, more aristocratic class. The vassal clans in Tuareg society tend to be pro-government and are opposing the direction taken by the traditional leadership of the Tuareg. So the rest of the opposition to the government is mostly Islamist in nature. You have the leading group is Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, led by Tuareg Iyad Agali, who was one of the most famous of the rebel leaders before he became an avowed Islamist. You also have a Fulani group from the Fulani tribe called Katiba Messina, And they're involved in many of these operations, although there's not much of a sign that they were involved in the operations of a few days ago. These groups are now, at least JNIM, the Jamaat Nusrat that I just mentioned, is operating in cooperation for the first significant time, not the first time, but the first real significant time with Tuareg separatists from northern Mali. These people are not Islamists, they are Muslims, but they're not representative of the Salafist jihadism that some of the other rebel groups in Mali tend to follow. They are.
Andrew, you're referring to JNIM. Is that the group you're referring to here?
Yeah, the group under Iyad Gali, right? Now they're an Islamist group, but the one I'm referring to now is the Azawad Liberation Front, commonly known as the FLA. And that is the result of a coalition of separatist groups. They don't have a religious ideology beyond just being Muslims. What they're looking for is an independent state in northern Mali that would incorporate the Tuareg and the other peoples living in that area, which they refer to as Azawad, right? So the difference with the Salafists is that they seek to impose a Muslim theocracy over all of Mali, under their leadership, of course. So the upshot of all this tension has been the attacks across Mali on April 25 and April 26. There was a large number of major cities and military bases that were subjected to simultaneous attacks. It does not seem like the Malian intelligence nor Russian intelligence had prepared government forces for these attacks. This cooperation between the separatists and JNIM, which is affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and this cooperation has permitted the largest attacks seen in Mali in about 15 years. And Glenn, you were saying about General Sadio Kamara, who was the victim of suicide bombing on his compound during the attacks. Sadio Kamara was best known for being both the number 2 man in the junta and also the leading advocate of a Russian military presence in Mali. So his death is quite significant. And it should also be mentioned that many of his followers were rounded up last year in yet another purge. And so he has been somewhat isolated in the junta ever since. But his death really does, it is a significant occurrence and will have a lot to do with what the future of Russian forces in Mali will be. Now, the president, General Goita, he disappeared for a few days during the attacks, but he turned up on Tuesday at the the Russian ambassador's residence of all places. And that was his first public appearance since the attacks. And just before I end this bit of an introduction, I just want to mention the battle for Kidal, which you mentioned, Gwen, earlier. That city has really represented the de facto capital of Tuareg separatism for about 10 years now. It was retaken by the Malian government with very major assistance from Russian forces in 2023. There's a famous photo of the Russian flag being raised over Kidal, which caused all kinds of diplomatic problems within the Malian government, who didn't really care for that. Something of a return to colonial attitudes that they really didn't want to present. The thing about the attack on Kidal is we've wound up with 2 conflicting narratives. The Russians themselves are saying there was a 24-hour firefight, that they fought overwhelming forces, and before eventually being driven out of Kidal. The FLA, the coalition of Tuareg separatists, has a completely different story, saying that before the attack even began, that they were negotiating with the Russian Africa Corps, which agreed to permanently abandon Kidal and hightailed it out of there without doing any fighting. There are reports that a large amount of Russian military equipment was left behind, which will now be used for further assaults on southern Mali, almost certainly. And the future of Russia's presence militarily in Mali is really now up in the air. They do not seem to have been able to do much to repel these attacks, although in Bamako and in the military bases just outside the capital, there were other reports that Russian jet fighters and assault helicopters were involved in trying to drive off the insurgents with only limited success. So I'll draw a line at that for the moment, and I hope that provided a bit of an introduction to what's going on there.
Okay. Jacob, let's hear what you have to say. Did this come as a surprise to you, Jacob, or did you kind of anticipate that this might be coming?
Thank you, Andrew and Glenn. This came as a surprise to me, as well as many other analysts, to the extent that most analysts did not expect JNIM to be so bold as to make an attack on Bamako and to currently undergo a siege of Bamako and to demonstrate that they have the potential to, if not now, soon, possibly even control Bamako. It was previously believed that maybe some of the mid-level towns in the north could fall under JNIM control, but Bamako was relatively safe. What these attacks demonstrated to me is that JNIM can make an attempt to control Bamako in the same way that HTS did by taking Damascus in Syria and the Taliban did by taking Kabul in Afghanistan several years ago. So Bamako is not off limits, and JNIM likely has a strategy if it seeks to take Bamako in the future, which would involve something along the lines of sieges, attacking the residences and offices of government officials and ministries, and detonating suicide bombings and having sleeper cells and so forth. At this time, it looks like they're receded from Bamako, but they're still surrounding the city, and it's very possible that much of the rest of the country could fall under JNIM control, as well as with the FLA in the north, particularly, as Andrew mentioned. One thing that's notable about JNIM in the past couple days, if not also in the past couple months and years to a lighter extent, is that JNIM, for example, in its recent statements, as Andrew alluded to, allowed Russia or Africa Corps to leave certain of their bases to retreat. And it even said in a statement that if Russia does this or Africa Corps does this, then it's willing to have some sort of friendly relations with Russia in the future, which drew a lot of comparisons to what happened in Syria, which with HTS. Of course, Russia had backed Assad, and now Ahmed al-Shara came to power, and he's willing to talk to Russia. Even the Taliban is now willing to talk to Russia. So JNIM seems to be preparing the footsteps for taking over the country in the future and becoming a legitimate jihadi actor, if you will, that's more or less accepted or quasi-accepted by the international community. And also, this raises some issues, however, with Islamic State in Greater Sahara, otherwise known as Islamic State in Sahel province, which is the very active IS province in the Sahel, which will seize on this to portray JNIM as infidels. And it's part of its decade-long portrayal of al-Qaeda affiliated groups like JNIM as the Jews of jihad, which in other words is saying that when al-Qaeda comes to power or its affiliates come to power, they often secularize, accept the international system, engage in diplomacy with a host of quote-unquote infidel actors. And JNIM seems to be doing the same thing in certain respects. Another example of ISGS attacking JNIM is this deal with the FLA. FLA, as Andrew mentioned, is basically an ethno-nationalist, secular group, ostensibly Muslim, but they don't push really Muslim agendas. And JNIM is willing to collaborate with the FLA in large tracts of northern Mali right now. This is another sign from ISGS perspective of JNIM catering to secular influences. From another perspective in international politics, this is JNIM just being pragmatic. But one of the complications of the scenario we have in Mali now is that unlike IS in Syria or IS in Afghanistan, which was targeted extensively by the US and other international forces, currently the US is not particularly active in the Sahelian picture, nor is France. And so I would say that IS has a much broader remit to operate without fearing international retribution. So after JNIM took control over large swaths of Mali over the past couple of weeks, ISGS took over Manaka in southern Mali, at least until a couple of days ago when it seems like they retreated. But ISGS is very much taking advantage of this scenario to fill power vacuums, contest JNIM, and issue narratives portraying Al-Qaeda and JNIM more broadly as infidels. I would also point out that JNIM's leader is Iyad Agali, as Andrew mentioned. He's been an ethno-nationalist secular rebel for multiple decades. However, over the past decade and a half, he made a genuine turn towards Salafism. At one point, he was posted to Saudi Arabia by the Malian government as some sort of reconciliation deal with the separatists, and he seems to have embraced Salafism during that time. And obviously, he affiliated with Al-Qaeda. But he's a shrewd negotiator, he's a diplomat, and he seems to be executing this decades of diplomatic experience by engaging with these relationships with the FLA and by helping to mitigate the JNIM jihadi rhetoric, which would pave the way for some acceptance in the future. And JNIM, over the past couple of years, when the Taliban took over Kabul and when HTS took over Damascus, JNIM issued essentially what are praiseworthy remarks. They've pledged loyalty to the Taliban in the future. So although JNIM perhaps more boldly remains within the Al-Qaeda fray than either the Taliban today or HTS in Syria, which to a certain extent has distanced themselves from global jihadism, JNIM seems to have accepted their template for taking over a country. And what we saw over the past weeks was the operational aspect, but it's important to also pay attention to the ideological and diplomatic aspects, which JNIM has been revealing over the past couple of weeks as well. While you're unmuting Andrew, I could talk a little bit about Nigeria.
Yeah, go ahead and tell
helpful.
us, just describe a little bit what's going on in Nigeria. Let's see here.
Yeah, while we work out the technology, I would add another point that I had intended to say originally, which was that these conflicts in the Sahel are highly regional in a way that, for example, ones in the Middle East, like Syria, are not to the same extent. For example, the Syrian conflict was highly porous when it came to Syria and Iraq, but the Turkish border was largely closed off. Obviously, the Golan was largely closed off when it came to Israel. Jordan was largely closed off when it came to Jordan. But when it comes to the Sahel, perhaps Algeria is more or less closed off. But Nigeria, Togo, Benin, Ghana, Chad, up to Libya, that's very much not closed off. Not to mention Niger and Burkina Faso, which have borders with Mali and are part of the Malian heartland. And perhaps the most active jihadist group in the world today is ISWAP in Nigeria, Islamic State in West Africa province. It is rivals with another group formerly led by Abu Shakau, which we call Boko Haram. But JNIM, over the past 2 years, has claimed attacks in Nigeria and is now well known to be operating in Nigeria, including with one of the smaller Al-Qaeda affiliates in Nigeria known as Ansaru. So this conflict and JNIM's accumulation of resources, money, weapons, arms, power is going to have a big influence on Nigeria, which is well known as the giant of Africa. And as stable as Nigeria might be in certain respects, politically, it's has a democracy that's been working now for several decades. It's going to be bearing the brunt of some of the after effects of what JNIM has done. And other countries like Togo, Benin, JNIM has carried out attacks in the borderlands of those countries. JNIM's on the cusp of the border with Senegal. It's on the cusp of the border with Ghana. So those countries have been attempting to up their border security, but they're going to have to do so in a much more urgent and strong way over the coming weeks and months. And it, of course, yeah.
I just wanted to add to what Jacob was saying about this, the regional dimensions of this conflict. The three states that have, in the Sahel, that have adopted military dictatorships, basically in the last few years, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, joined together to form their own military alliance, meant to replace the former alliance that was headed by France. And this is meant to be an anti-Western, anti-European, anti-colonial alliance, though it does, the three countries involved have one thing in common, is that they all have Russian troops on their territory. So this alliance is called the Alliance of Sahel States. And one of the reports I found most interesting came from Niger yesterday, where they are now claiming that the air forces of Niger, Burkina Faso have joined the Malian Air Force in conducting intensive airstrikes on northern Mali. So this would, if true, mean a regional spread of this conflict already, at least so far as new actors coming into play.
So, Andrew, can you explain just what is the current status of Russian forces? So have they left Kidali, the city in the north, or
yes,
they
are gone from Kidal? The entire city's been taken over by rebel forces now.
Okay, so when you talk about airstrikes in the north, you're referring to the I guess we call it the military junta. Is that the right the group that's still in power, working with the Chadian government? Is that correct?
They're not working with the Chadian government. This cooperation between Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali.
Okay,
the three
Niger,
members of this alliance. Yeah.
So Niger is working with the junta then in Mali.
That's what they're saying. That they have now joined the fight, at least with their air forces.
Okay.
So we could see a possible spread. The future of the Russian forces is really up in the air. They have failed dismally in providing the security that they promised in Mali and the other two nations. There has been a string of major defeats in the last 2 years in Mali of combined forces of the Malian regular forces and the Africa Corps, and before that, the Wagner group. So they have not been successful at all, and they have in fact antagonized large parts of the population into joining rebel formations.
Do you attribute this, Andrew, to the fact that the Russians just in general are not good in doing counterinsurgency operations? Do you think that that's attributed to that?
I think it's an area they have almost no experience in. I think that's been a big problem. I think culturally and environmentally, this is foreign territory for the Russians. There's a big difference between the kind of operations you can carry out in the Sahara Desert and what you might carry out in the mountains of the Caucasus, where Russians have been fighting for the last 300 years. So they don't have the experience. I don't think they have the commitment. And in fact, one of the big problems right now is that the Russian leadership feels that they are not getting what they were promised. They promised security in exchange for rights to all kinds of gold mines and mineral resources. And there has been tardiness, I'll call it, on the part of the regime to actually transfer these resources over into Russian hands. So you might say that some of the reluctance to help defeat this current offensive by separatists and Islamic groups could be caused by deliberate reluctance in the command of the Africa Corps, in terms of, as soon as we start getting what we want, then we will provide the security that we promised. But I think day by day, we're getting in a situation where that's getting to be a bit late.
So is your impression that the Russians were, well, certainly my impression that the Russians have envision themselves as being guarantors. They provide security for the mines that they're operating, say, like in Sudan, where they're extracting the gold, escorting it out in and out. I mean, is that what they were envisioning for themselves in Mali, or is their operations in Mali mostly one where they're confined to bases and going out to the rural areas periodically to as a show of force to conduct counterinsurgency operations? Is that kind of what they've been doing in Mali?
I think there's a bit of both at work there, Glenn. They do have most of their forces on military bases, and some of the operations they've managed to get a hand in. They have provided local security for that. But of course, providing security for a gold mine is different than providing national security against major insurgent groups. There's a world of difference there. And I think if they're not getting the resources that they feel they were promised, they will be reluctant to carry out their half of the bargain. There is some suspicion about Russian intentions in the capital. We've seen the president, Goita, actually bring in Turkish mercenaries for his personal bodyguard force. And that is a role that the Russians had held before and thought that they were going to continue to hold. So while Goita is not completely abandoning the Russian project, I think he's a bit suspicious and is wondering just how this is going to turn out. And he doesn't want it to turn out with Russian soldiers entering his office and replacing him, just as he replaced the president before him.
Do you agree with what Jacob said about this Syria scenario for Mali, where the Russians kind of, at the end of the day, when all the smoke clears, are kind of still left in their bases, and then there's a new government coming in, and they just kind of like say, "Okay, thank you," and greet the new JNIM military government? Or I mean, what do you see kind of their future in Mali?
There's a bit of a difference. Syria is much more important strategically to Russia. Let's be honest, the Sahel has almost no strategic importance to Russia, except in terms of possible access to resources. The Russians are certainly not there out of any kind of altruistic purposes. If there's money to be made there, that's what they're interested in. Gold, of course, is only good for use as money. It has limited number of technical uses. There is uranium in the Sahel, but Niger has the biggest supplies of that. And there are Russian forces in Niger as well right now. But Mali is the most active place for insurgencies at the moment. And it is here that we can really see the failure of Russian combat forces from the defense ministry in the field. They just haven't been able to carry out what they promised and have been subject to ambushes in terrain that is really not known to them. And I'll note that today, one of the biggest bases in Mali, Tessalit, in the north near the Algerian border, was completely surrendered over to insurgent forces today without a fight. And you would almost certainly have had Russian forces at that base as well.
What about Russian airstrikes? Do you believe that those reports are true, that they actually have some military air contingent operating in Mali that's able to conduct airstrikes?
As far as I'm concerned, these reports have been verified. There's plenty of witnesses in the capital, Bamako, who saw these airstrikes. You have to remember, this isn't really the Russian Air Force. You just got a couple of jet fighters that are kind of on loan to the Africa Corps. And Mali's own Air Force is severely limited. It has about 4 jet trainers and not much else at the moment. I think they had an order in for something else. But of course, it takes time to train up pilots and all that kind of thing. Before the entrance of the Russians into the area, it was quite common to hire Ukrainian mercenaries to be pilots in the Malian Air Force. And of course, the Russians now are claiming that much of this offensive has been planned and sponsored by Ukrainian intelligence. They haven't provided any evidence of that.
And you haven't seen any signs of Ukrainians operating, like you did say in Sudan. There were some reports, and
there was some verifiable evidence. I think about 2 years ago. I'm sure Jacob might remember when there was a successful ambush of Russian forces in northern Mali, and there were photos presented with some of the insurgents carrying Ukrainian flags and saying that they had received Ukrainian training. But as far as the latest offensive goes, I haven't seen any sign that Ukrainians are involved. Not impossible. I mean, Ukrainian intelligence has said it will go to every corner of the earth to take on the Russians, and they have appeared in various surprising places like Sudan in the past. But I haven't seen anything saying that they have been part of this current operation as of yet.
Well, thank you. I turn to you now, Jacob. What do you see about kind of like the future of the JNIM, the FLA, the Tuareg, all of these groups? What do you predict that these groups will be able to maintain this uneasy alliance going forward, or will they kind of start dividing among themselves? Because this Tuareg dynamic that Andrew talks about of the upper echelons of the Tuareg, of their society, having sway over other parts of the kind of the government aligned elements of the Tuareg. Do you see that kind of playing out, or is this going to be a very kind of continuing tortured history of Mali going forward?
I think that's a core question, and you sort of hit the nail on the button there. I tend to think that left to their own devices, this JNIM FLA alliance or partnership that's going on right now, I don't think it would last. I tend to think they would end up fighting each other, because under the current relationship, it seems that the FLA, which is ethno-nationalist at heart, would need to accept some type of, Islamist influence throughout its areas in order to maintain peace with JNIM. And JNIM would need to allow sort of the ethno-nationalist Tuareg identity to be supreme in certain FLA areas. But I tend to think that JNIM's ideology is pretty hardcore at the root of it. And a lot of JNIM members are not Tuaregs at the end of the day. So I think at the end of the day, JNIM would probably end up fighting the FLA if they ever both took control of the country, and would sort of force the FLA to submit to the broader JNIM Islamist objectives. Or at least it would make JNIM become the main power, and then the FLA would just sort of be at peace. It could be, or maybe, if JNIM ever took control of large swaths, then Yada Ghali would be sort of like Ahmed Ashara, where he tried to make like local deals with certain leaders in certain regions, like you've seen him try to do with the Druze in certain parts of the country. But it could end up like Ahmed Ashara with the Kurds, where he forces his central government to take control. I guess one of the possible ways that the JNIM FLA relationship could maintain peace is that Yada Ghali is a Tuareg himself. So he could, better than any other, say, Fulani leader, maintain relations with the FLA. But I still think ideologically it's very murky. But here's the ultimate complication, in my opinion. As you were just talking about with Andrew, there were alleged, perhaps peripheral relationships between the FLA and Ukraine a couple years ago, which would make sense in some ways because Ukraine could support the FLA and not JNIM to upset Russia in the Sahel as part of their broader global battle. The FLA in some ways probably has some relationships with France, not to say that France is subverting Mali, as a lot of Malians have claimed. But the FLA is an organization with which countries abroad can work, because it is ethno-nationalist and secular and not inherently anti-Western in the way that JNIM is. Now, if it were to happen in the future that the FLA and JNIM contested for power in Mali, and then foreign power supported the FLA elements to fight JNIM and defeat JNIM, then you would likely have a lot of internecine warfare between the two, but that could ironically help ISGS become more powerful. And so you can't ignore that factor. Because in the past, in fact, ISGS claimed that when France was still in Mali, that France was targeting ISGS with the tacit coordination of JNIM to weaken ISGS and help JNIM, because ISGS was then seen as the biggest threat to the world as part of the global anti-ISIS coalition. So there are a number of actors in this conflict. So supporting one against the other, or one winning against the other, can help a third or fourth. And so that's just the complexity of this scenario.
Andrew, wearing your hat as a historian, how do you see this kind of playing out? I mean, if you take a step back and look at, say, the history of Mali, which you covered so eloquently in the beginning, of the past 100 years, but in the past 20 years, I mean, do you agree with what Jacob's saying? Do you think these balances could, finally settle down, and if they develop this, where is this going internally with these rivalries and delicate balances of these ethnic groups, FLA considered, Tuareg and others?
I think Jacob has really pointed out the irreconcilable agendas of some of these groups. We've seen what they can do when they pull together. When they start pulling apart, what happens then? I think we'll see further devastation of an already impoverished nation that's been under severe pressure for many years now, including a degree of political violence that is just enormous. Looking ahead, I think we have to look at the possibility of another coup.
You mean a coup or counter coup versus coup, and then another group walks in
from inside the junta itself? I think Goita is showing signs of weakness, and juntas are always alert for weakness, and they also embody a degree of ambition on the part of all their members, who basically risk their lives to get into that position. So they'll be quite eager to seize any main chance that they might come across to remove someone who's not moving the agenda forward, who's not securing the country, and who's not gaining any of the benefits that were promised through military rule. The future of democracy, I don't think there's much of a future for it in the coming years. You have too many groups that have too much at stake in the political field here, and they are not going to all this effort just to step aside in favor of someone else, or to let the people have their say. They all have their own ambitions and agendas that they want to forward. So I can only see more instability in the future. We don't have any Western presence anymore in Mali, so Western influence is pretty much nil at the moment.
Jacob, I guess that raises the question that I've been wanting to ask, is that U.S. counterterrorism policy was very prevalent, very active in the region up until around, until the first Trump administration, and then it just kind of dissipated. Even with all the U.S. strikes in Nigeria, and your reporting, you wrote a report recently about Russian influence in northern Nigeria. I mean, is there any signs of American interest and involvement and possible return in terms of counterterrorism strategy in the region?
Over the past couple of years, it did seem that there were some back channel U.S. talks with these Sahelian juntas in the Russian-backed alliance of Sahelian states. And that seemed to be occurring in the context of these military juntas realizing that Russian support for counterinsurgency was not very successful, and them trying to maybe use the U.S. as sort of a plan B if things didn't work out. That being said, the U.S. is so involved with Iran and Israel in the Middle East now, and Trump is getting some heat for that. The U.S. is still involved with Russia and Ukraine. There's still global terrorism issues elsewhere, like Somalia. And if there's any priority for the U.S. in West Africa, it's Nigeria. But Nigeria is a hard country to work with because they have this history of being very pro-sovereignty. So any support to Nigeria comes a little bit through the side, and it's not major. So, and the U.S. at least has inroads in Nigeria. It's sort of an Anglophone country. The U.S. has more of a history with the country. And even during the Obama administration, the U.S. helped with Boko Haram to a certain extent. And the U.S., already set up a military base in Niger that Niger just took away when these coups happened. So now for the U.S. to go all the way back in, it's going to be politically quite difficult for the U.S. right now. It's like Niger almost lost its chance. I don't see much political will or U.S. public backing for the U.S. to get involved in this major conflagration in the Sahel right now. I could see potentially if Russia left and then the junta said, sorry, we'll engage in some democratic reforms in whatever parts of the country we control, then maybe they could establish some relationships with the U.S. But I don't see it being major enough to deal any decisive blow against these insurgents. I could also see, just to touch on the future of the Sahel itself, perhaps if there was a coup, like Andrew indicated, might happen in Bamako, I could see a new Bamako government making some tacit deal with the insurgents like JNIM, saying, you take control of the north, let us keep the south, let us keep Bamako, and then JNIM would have control of the north. But I think that would be more of a Vietnam 1973, 1975 type of moment, where JNIM would say, okay, we'll take the north, and then eventually they would move to the south when they have the chance. So you might get some short-term pieces and truces, but right now the trend line is largely in favor of the insurgent/jihadists/separatists. And it would have to be a major about face for the U.S. to get back into the fray. I could really only imagine the U.S. getting back involved in the Sahel is if the Iran and Israel-Lebanon situation pacified, Ukraine and Russia came to peace, and then the U.S. said, okay, let's look around the world where we can put some resources. But that doesn't seem to be on the horizon.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jacob. Andrew, I'm going to give you the final word. And I guess what I'm wondering is it maybe a positive element that these countries that they were reaching out to each other in lieu of no Western powers other than Russia being involved in the region? I mean, is this maybe a sign that they're realizing that our best ability to control the future is working together without the colonial powers? I mean, is there some positive element in there?
Well, the French spent about 10 years trying to convince them that was the future, was working together, in this case with French assistance, but that cooperation in the Sahel region would be the political future and would be the means to deal with all these insurgencies and rebellions and terrorist activities going on. As far as having some kind of real positive effect, I think what you're seeing is a small time commitment from small time militaries, say in Burkina Faso and Niger. They're making a bit of a demonstration, perhaps with a few airstrikes, but they don't have the means to really get involved in a meaningful way in Mali. They have their own problems at home. They have had their own defeats at the hands of the Islamists and separatists in their own territories. So I don't see any, I'm not seeing any kind of boots across the border entering Mali to assist the government. In fact, along the lines of what Jacob was saying, I think separatism is really the major force in Mali right at the moment. JNIM, I don't think, has the means of taking the South and keeping it. I believe that the raids in Bamako are a means of creating political conditions favorable to the establishment of a theocratic government in northern Mali. And as we've been talking about, this immediately leads into conflicts with the more secular separatist movement in Mali. So what do we get? We get a first separation, and then we get a new civil war in the new separate state. It's a likely scenario, unfortunately. But I don't see this coalition between separatists and Islamists continuing into some kind of, new future for Mali or any kind of bright future for Mali. They have had success by cooperating, but they're not going to be together for very long. Their agendas and ambitions are just down different highways entirely. So I think this is going to be short-lived. Both sides want the same thing, to create conditions favorable to the furtherance of their own political agendas.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you, Andrew, for appearing today. Our guests on the Eyes on Eurasia podcast have been Andrew McGregor and Jacob Zenn. We want to thank you for taking the time to be with us. They will be posting the podcast, and a video of it will be also posted afterward as well. And thank you for sharing your insights. The only thing I see happening here is more palace intrigue. So and more smoke on the horizon. So anyway, thank you, gentlemen. It's great seeing you again virtually, and thank you for sharing your insights. So this is the Eyes on Eurasia podcast with Glenn Howard. Thanks for joining us, and give us a shout and say hi and give us a like. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Glenn. Bye now.